The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Then Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He hardly knew what to say, they were so terrified. Then a cloud came, casting a shadow over them. From the cloud came a voice, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone but Jesus with them. As they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them not to relate what they had seen to anyone, except when the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. When we had our annual confession service right before Christmas, I was a little bit embarrassed because I, as usual, invited Father Houlihan to come to Cambridge to hear confessions, and not a single person went to him. And you might think, wow, they must have all gone to you, Father, and you're correct. All one of them went to me. So when I say every single one, I mean that literally. One person came to the penance service. So that tells me that we could use a little bit of a refresher, a little bit of a pep talk about the sacrament of confession. So that's going to be the theme for this Lent, the sacrament of confession. And I'll save all of the theology regarding confession for my educational homilies. Instead, we're going to go over the sacrament itself in terms of how to make a good confession. It is a precept once a year to, particularly before Easter, make a good confession in order to receive communion at Easter. Meaning that being a precept of the church, it is something that every Catholic is required to do. It's the bare minimum, going to confession once a year. And that also means that if you haven't gone to confession in over a year, it's something you should probably mention the next time you do. So these homilies are, they're not meant for me to sound self-righteous. I'm a sinner too. I went to confession last Saturday. These homilies are meant to help you dive deeper into your spiritual life, the things that you need God's help with, the things that you struggle with, so that this Lent you can grow closer to God through this sacrament of confession. I know there's a lot of different reasons why people don't like to go to confession or don't go to confession, and I'll address those in a bit. But one of those reasons is that people don't see a need for it. It's easy to think, well, I'm a good person. It's not like I murdered anybody. Why would I need to go to confession? And to me, that sort of mindset, it's indicative that you haven't taken the time to reflect on your life. If I were given any amount of time to think about what I've done wrong today, I could come up with a list of things. Particularly their spiritual life, it's something worth thinking about. And when we think, I haven't murdered anybody, that's, it tells me that we need to slow down and reflect. Because there are things that we do all the time that don't involve murder. And it's those things that we ought to be confessing. In fact, I'm going to be preaching on confession for 4 weeks, and murder is only going to get about 30 seconds of airtime, right? So let's approach this topic from the perspective of the 10 Commandments. Each week I will talk about some of them. And today I'll be talking about the first commandment. Thou shalt not have other gods before me. And you might be thinking, well, Father, it's not like I'm worshiping the devil or pagan gods or anything like that, so this can move on to the next commandment, right? I haven't broken that one. And those sorts of things would certainly fall into the first commandment. So things like partaking in seances or using Ouija boards or consulting mediums. If you've done anything like that, for sure confess those things. But even if you haven't done any of those things, I can 100% guarantee you that you have still broken the first commandment. And that's because every sin is a sin against the first commandment. Every time you sin, you put something ahead of God. You make that thing a false god. Every time you sin, you make something else your god, and in so doing so, you're breaking the first commandment. And it can be anything: money, personal comfort, power, influence, sexuality, ambition, self-interest. We can even break the first commandment with things that on the outside are really good things, right? Like family. Say, well, Father, I went to my granddaughter's basketball game, but because of that, I missed Mass last Sunday. That's putting something else ahead of God. Basketball is not a legitimate reason to miss Mass. Ask yourself if, in any situation since the last time you went to confession, of whether or not you prioritize something ahead of God. And if the answer is yes, which it probably is for all of us, and it is for me quite often, daily in fact, then we've broken the first commandment, and that should be something we talk about in our next confession. Putting God first also means that we are obedient to everything that God has taught. You know, sometimes we would rather do things on our own, or simply just go with the culture of the times in which we live because it's a lot easier. Some of the things that God asks of us might not be the easiest path in life or the easiest for us to accept. And when we struggle with these things, it could be a sign that we don't trust God completely in these certain areas. We don't trust God when it comes to his teachings on sexuality or marriage or family or gender. God's teaching on these things are completely counter to what the world teaches, the world that we live in, and that's a very difficult current to swim against. Heck, going to confession, period, is something that is completely countercultural. We are sort of subconsciously trained from a very young age to think, you know, you don't need confession. Just be kind and just be you. The problem with that is that Jesus never says, just be kind. And sometimes just be you doesn't work either, because sometimes just being me is the exact opposite thing I need to be doing, right? Because sometimes I'm lazy, sometimes I'm self-centered, sometimes I'm rather brisk with people in my words, and those are things I bring to confession every single time I go. It could be that there are simply some church teachings that you outright refuse to accept, and I get it. Obedience isn't the easiest path. And that's been the case ever since original sin happened. We're averse even to the word obedience. It sounds like a bad word. And of all the promises that I made on my ordination day, obedience is the most difficult. When thinking of priests, most people's minds, especially young people's minds, they tend to go immediately to our promise of celibacy. How in the world could you give that up? How would you live without physical intimacy or a spouse or a family? But that one isn't as difficult as you think. A priest is only giving up one more woman than any other married man is, right? And at this point in my life, no woman deserves the punishment of living with me anyways. So, another promise that we make on our ordination day is to pray for your people 5 times a day. No problem. That's easy. But obedience, that's the one thing that all priests really agree is the challenge. At our ordination, the bishop asks us, do you promise respect and obedience to me and to my successors? And we respond, I do. And that's the most difficult thing that we're asked to do as a priest, to trust another human being with the rest of my life. Personally, that doesn't suit my personality, and it comes up for me every time I go to confession. We can have the same struggles with the church, right? Sometimes things are just easier when we do things our way, according to our plan. But we're not called to follow our plan, we're called to follow God's plan. And the truth is that God is God, and we are not God. We don't make the rules. God sees the whole picture. And when we finally do see the whole picture in heaven, if we ever do get to see the whole picture, we'll be embarrassed to see his plan from his perspective and how much better things would have been had we simply listened to him. God's ways are not our ways. I have to do a lot of praying and self-examination to come to grips with that. To not think that I know better than the bishop. To not think that I know better than the pope. To not think that I know better than the church. To not think that I know better than God. Putting my will last does not come naturally to me and probably to any of us. And so when I go to confession, breaking the first commandment, thou shalt not have any gods before me, it's often the first thing that I confess. And perhaps it should be for most of us. But there are more layers to the first commandment in addition to this. We can talk about our witness and our example to others. If people see that we're not following the teaching of Jesus and his church, then that's an even worse sin. Perhaps this could even lead us to deliberately misleading others about the faith. Oh yeah, confession, I don't really do that. Oh yeah, contraception, nobody really follows those rules anymore. This isn't even more serious than simply breaking the commandment yourself, because now you're involving somebody else's soul and their salvation. And your actions are telling them that it's okay to ignore some of the things that the church teaches. It's okay to pick and choose from the things that God has said is true, assigning our own value, our own convenience to God's own words, and rejecting some of them outright. In that case, we've essentially made ourselves God and ourselves the authority, and the false God that we're worshiping is us. There's further ways in which we can break the first commandment. If we reject an aspect of our faith, or if we're wishy-washy on an issue, perhaps it's because we haven't done enough to nourish our own faith, and so that can be another aspect of breaking the first commandment. Jesus says that faith the size of a mustard seed can do amazing things, but like any seed, it still needs watering and fertilizing. And so if we fail to water and nourish our faith, that's a failure of the first commandment. And we nourish our faith with the sacraments, including confession. We nourish our faith with Eucharistic adoration. We nourish our faith by practicing devotions like novenas or praying the Rosary or the Divine Mercy Chaplet. We nourish our faith through prayer. We nourish our faith by educating ourselves. Sometimes I hear in confession, I didn't know such and such was a sin, and so now I'm confessing it now. Now, I don't expect most people to be theologians, but do you know who else are not theologians? Doctors aren't. Psychiatrists aren't. Social workers aren't. School teachers aren't. News anchors aren't. Politicians certainly aren't. Funeral directors aren't theologians. And if they're not aware of everything the church teaches, why would we assume so? When it comes to questions that might have serious implications, why would we trust their opinions? So we should educate ourselves. Anytime something involves morality or sexuality or family or marriage, we need to get the Catholic answer, because we won't find that anywhere else in the secular world. If we entrust our souls to someone who hasn't the foggiest idea about the teachings of the church, what do you think the outcome will be? When making decisions, don't you think it would be a good idea to see what the church says about that thing, and then you can weigh it against what you've been told by people who live in the secular world? So that's why it's a good idea to do things like Bible in a year, or catechism in a year, or attend faith education classes or Bible studies. We can only claim ignorance up to a certain point before it actually becomes not ignorance but negligence. And if we don't do these things, then we'll eventually be worn away by the world around us, and we'll cave when church teaching is challenged by the majority opinion. If all we do is go to Sunday Mass and think our faith is complete, we're deceiving ourselves. 1 hour a week against a tidal wave that is opposing the church, opposing God's teaching, everything else in the world, that would be like expecting to survive an entire week on just one sip of water. If we don't nourish the seed of faith, then we've broken the first commandment. So we shouldn't look past the first commandment. Even if you haven't worshipped the devil or pagan gods or anything like that, or practice witchcraft, you can still think about the first commandment when you are examining your conscience before making a good confession. If you don't go to confession, or if you haven't been in a really long time, or if it's been since last Lent that you went, or whenever, we need to ask ourselves why. And there's 10 reasons that I can think of why people hesitate to make use of this sacrament. Reason number 1, I don't go to confession because I don't know what to say. And that's the purpose of these homilies, to help you examine your conscience so that you can make a good confession after thoroughly examining that conscience. Reason number 2, I don't go to confession because I'm afraid to. And that's a common one. First of all, you don't have anything to fear from the priest. Your confession, sorry to break it to you, generally sounds like every confession we hear, right? We're human beings. We've only discovered so many ways in which to sin. And despite that, we've heard it all. You're not going to surprise a priest. If you're afraid of confession, ask God for courage. Ask God to strengthen your faith in his words and your faith in the absolute secrecy of the seal of confession. Even before a court of law, we cannot break the seal of confession. Reason number 3, I don't go to confession because I always end up confessing the same things every time. Now let me just say, I would be alarmed if it was your goal to come up with new ways in which to sin. Every time you went to confession, you shouldn't be trying to do such things. Of course, your confession is probably largely going to sound the same. Mine do, because you're the same person as the last time you went. Hopefully you've grown closer to God, but you still have the same temptations, the same flaws. And if you're frustrated that you have to keep going back to confession, welcome to the club. If you keep confessing a habitual sin, something that has been a problem for you for a long time, perhaps even your whole life, that means that you need confession all the more. It's not the time to give up going to confession. What good will it do to stop going to confession because we commit the same sin over and over? How in the world is that going to help, right? What makes us think that we'd be better off dealing with this sin on our own rather than going to confession? You can't overcome a habitual sin without the graces of God. Reason number 4, I don't go to confession because I just can't seem to make the time for it. I don't know if anybody knows this, but I sit in the confessional for half an hour before Mass at every weekend Mass, and it's not like business is booming. There's not a line going out of the church, people waiting to go to confession. All you have to do is come to Mass 10 minutes early, and you'll still have plenty of time to go to confession. If you feel like you just can't get around to it, make it a Lenten goal of yours. It seems that when you make time for God, He will give extra time to your day. That's just how it works. Reason number 5, I don't go to confession because I just don't know where to start. And that's why we have these examination of conscience sheets. They're right outside the confessional in the little pamphlet holder. You can just use it as a checklist. You can use the Laudate app on your phone. There's information about that in the bulletin. There's a part of the app you can bring the phone with you into the confessional. You click on confession, and then there's different categories that you can choose from that apply to you. So if you're married, if you're single, if you're an adult, if you're a young adult, if you're a child, so on and so forth. And you can check off the boxes and literally hit enter and just read off what you've checked off in a list. It makes it very, very easy. Reason number 6, it will take too long to go to confession because it's been so long since my last confession. And the only thing I have to say to that is it's my job to hear confessions. I'm not going to mind if somebody takes longer than they think is necessary. Whatever it takes is what it takes. Reason number 7, I don't go to confession because I don't really need the sacrament of confession. I can just go to God and confess my sins on my own. And that's true. We should confess our sins on our own every day. Usually at the end of every day is the traditional way of doing it before we go to bed. But that's not all that we should do, because that's not what Jesus tells us. If we look at the first words of Jesus to his disciples after he rises from the dead, what are they? The first words of the resurrected Christ are this: be not afraid, receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven, whose sins you retain are retained. The first words of the resurrection are literally, go to confession. He could have chosen anything to say in that moment that, you think these would be rather important words, first words of the resurrected Christ, and they are. His first words are, go to confession. So if we struggle with believing in the need for confession, that is certainly something that we need to bring to prayer, because that is certainly something that is in opposition to Jesus' direct words. It is a case where we're struggling with the first commandment, where we're putting ourselves against something directly revealed to us by God. Reason number 8, I don't go to confession because it's been so long since my last confession. And if the hurdle is remembering everything that you've ever done, simply start with things that you can remember. You can always go back to confession again if you remember something later. You'll never catch a priest off guard by saying it's been 20, 40, 50 years since your last confession. You're never going to hear a priest say, it's been how long? That's not how it works. There is rejoicing. When I hear, Father, it's been 20 years since my last confession, I'm holding back tears of joy. Reason number 9, I don't go to confession because God will forgive me anyway. This one is in the mindset of an even more serious sin called the sin of presumption. where we presume that God has already forgiven us. We essentially take God's mercy for granted. And there is a rather glaring problem with that, because God can't forgive us if we don't ask for forgiveness. It's the only sin that can't be forgiven is the unrepentant sin. And the normal way in which God grants forgiveness, but also complete assurance of our forgiveness, is through the sacrament of confession, as revealed to us in the Scriptures. Reason number 10. I don't go to confession because I don't think I can be forgiven. I don't think God will forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. And that's an even more serious sin called despair. The truth is that God is all-powerful and all-merciful. He can forgive anything. To think that God cannot do something as simple as forgiving little old me of my sins puts a lot of limitations on who God actually is. God is greater than our limitations. He's greater than your sin. None of us is worthy to receive that sort of mercy, but God can't help himself. Don't reject that mercy. That is a sign of pride. Instead, humble yourself and allow him to love you, no matter how unworthy you feel. Allow him to shower with his grace. And thankfully, despair is only one step away from the strongest faith imaginable. And that is a faith in God even when you don't feel worthy of him, when we feel far away from him, and when you don't feel his presence. When we doubt his presence and still have faith, that is faith put to the truest test. So this week, think of the things that I've talked about. Why don't I go to confession more often? What do I need to be praying about for me to see the value in the sacrament? What do I need to be praying for in order to strengthen my faith in what God has revealed to us about confession? And perhaps you can return to the readings that we just heard. We've had the story of Abraham in our first reading, where he is asked to sacrifice of his son Isaac. That is the definition of faith. We know the story well. He's asked to sacrifice his only son of his old age. Put yourself in Abraham's shoes. Wouldn't your mind be racing? What in the world, God? How is this part of your plan? I don't see how this makes any sense at all. And yet he has faith. And his faith is rewarded. When we struggle to accept what God has revealed to us in the teachings of the church or the teachings of Jesus himself, ask him for the faith of Abraham. We have St. Paul in our second reading addressing those who are facing persecution. He says, if God is for us, who can be against us? We need to ask God for that kind of faith, complete surrender to his will, even if it is in the face of persecution or even death. And finally, we have the Transfiguration in today's gospel. The Transfiguration was a sign to Jesus' disciples that he is who he says he is, that he is the only Son of God. He appears in his glorified state. And perhaps it was the experience and the memory of the Transfiguration that prevented his disciples from losing their faith entirely after Jesus was crucified. Because for a few seconds they witnessed Jesus' true resurrected glory, and maybe that was just enough for them not to go down the same path as Judas. The Transfiguration was a sign to the disciples that what Jesus says is true. In the words of the Father, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And what is he telling us? He says, "Be not afraid, receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven, whose sins you retain are retained."